Well, good morning, family. The remarks that I have today may not be palatable to all of you because they have to do with my view of the evolution of the therapeutic community over some 50 years and some of the pluses and minuses of that evolution. And of course, my investment has been to do whatever I can, both from the standpoint of research and training and policy, to make it better, to make the therapeutic community as an even better approach. But I've come to some working conclusions, so you will have to indulge me on this. I may wind up being wrong on this, and it'll be good if I am. But I feel obligated to this talk because I wanted to bring everybody else into this discussion in terms of where the therapeutic community is as an approach after 50 years, and what are possibly some considerations going forward. So in a short talk, I'm not going to obviously cover it all. I'm hoping that through the rest of the conference, if there's still enough interest in some of my remarks, we will talk about it in some subsequent panel discussions. I think it'll come up, and of course individually. Is this water for me, or is it? I have no help up here. This is total abandonment, and
how many people do you need?
Well, right now you're a dark illusion, so I don't, What we're saying in this introductory point is that there have been tremendous accomplishments in the TC over these past 50 years, and that these accomplishments, of course, have brought us to a certain point where I capture them in the idea of TCs moving from an alternative approach to a mainstream approach. And this is what has been the drive of our industry from the beginning, to become part of mainstream public health. And everybody wanted that, but of course there was still some unknown barriers and pitfalls in that. And gradually these have accumulated over time. That is, the transition to the mainstream has essentially brought with it a number of problems that paradoxically have actually affected the quality of the therapeutic community approach. In many ways, the word integrity is used, and that'll be used a little later in the conference. The word I like to use is the fidelity of that. So what I want to do in a brief period of time is essentially just try to capture just highlight what have been the accomplishments of this, and then come back to what have been the main issues in essentially getting to these accomplishments. So I tried to, in a brief talk, how do you capture the accomplishments? Just four kind of domains in this. One is, if I can see it, the considerable research, of course, documenting the effectiveness and the cost effectiveness and cost benefits of the TC. And that very last point on that slide in bullet number 1, the fact of recovery, and all this is underlined because in the early days, of course, of drug addiction, heroin addiction in particular, no one ever really believed in recovery. The word was hardly used then. And the phrase, once a junkie, you can finish that. Once a junkie, what? Yeah, that was the belief then. So the idea that recovery from heroin addiction in particular was possible was still a little bit remote. So one of the great contributions of TC research, the approach itself, and then some of the research beginning to document that, was that we were able to document the fact that people did recover from heroin addiction. The second whole area of accomplishment that we can't detail here, of course, has been the application of the approach to special populations and special settings, a wide range of damaged populations that have been referred to in some of the earlier talks. The TC enthusiastically attempted to work with those people, and of course, evaluation studies with those populations have shown a very, very impressive success and improvements in their lives. So that's a documented accomplishment. The emergence, this is one that I like, but the emergence of what I would call a theory of disorder and the theory of recovery particularly the approach itself, the therapeutic community fundamentally developing an understanding and what I would call a theory of how it works. The reason why I have this as a major accomplishment is because the approach itself, as you know, was developed by the first generation of participants. So it did not come from academia, it did not come from public health, did not come from medicine, it came from the recovering people themselves. So we have a powerful approach. Consider that message for a moment. You have a powerful approach which was developed by the people who are afflicted by the disorder itself. So this idea that ultimately a theory was able to be constructed was a gradual and incremental development over the years in terms of from clinical experience and some research experience, which ultimately began to make clear about what this approach is and what we do and how we do it. This will turn out to be the central thesis of what I'm talking about, is what has happened to that approach in terms of what we call now the best understanding of the theory of the therapeutic community. And the final point as an area of accomplishment, again, these are general statements, and that is that the therapeutic communities actually developed, beginning in the 60s and then moving into later on, developed actually the first cadre of recovery workers, counselors, coaches. They literally essentially helped the drug treatment field establish a labor force that could address the issues of recovery. Now, not simply, I'm not talking about medical management for the moment, I'm talking about social psychological recovery. So our first labor forces were really largely developed by people moving from the TC experiences. And the phrase I also use, if you're looking at this slide, is that same cadre also advanced the recovery movement in general. So it's not only did it contribute a labor force to the drug treatment field, but also advanced the whole recovery movement, namely that there are recovered people and that this is essentially largely coming from the individuals themselves. Mutual self-help has become now a kind of accepted approach in all of drug treatment, and of course the belief that people can recover. So that quickly, and I admit it's only quickly, is a summary of areas that I would say are major accomplishments. In that process of moving into the mainstream, the very accomplishments that I've been talking about, and some other factors, political factors outside of the TC, particularly funding, issues of some stigma and perceptions of the TC by those who didn't quite understand the approach. And I would argue, over the 50 years, internal factors in the TC itself, as if you had an approach which was trying to mature itself, but was also making mistakes in its own right. I don't mean necessarily abuses, but the issues of expansion and the issues of the scope of what they can do, the aspirations of what the TC can do, and was it really keeping up with this very, very important issue of maintaining the fidelity of the approach. It's this whole area that has been what I would call the issues of evolution that needed to be addressed, and it ultimately rests in this last bullet on the slide, which is the gradual erosion, a strong word, folks, the erosion of the therapeutic approach itself. Now, this doesn't necessarily describe every program, and you can't get offended in terms of what you're doing, but if you look at it worldwide, but particularly North America, but worldwide, the picture is there is too many examples of the erosion of the approach, and therefore this is why the talk is has an alarm bell to it. So, quick summary of accomplishments and a quick description of what I mean by what are some of the fundamental issues. Now, the top bullet on this, before I leave this slide, has to do with an element which is outside of the TC, which is the funding and policy approach, namely, which I've considered probably the most significant shock to the development of the therapeutic community, which is the whole funding and planned duration of treatment. And remember this now, that the original TCs in the 1960s for addiction primarily heroin addiction, but we treated a wide variety of other substance abuses and with wide variety of other problems too. But the fundamental issue there was long-term treatment. All the research showed at the time, some of the early research that I did ultimately got corroborated and replicated worldwide and by other investigators, other cultures and so on, was of course this standard outcome finding that we found, that the longer you stayed in treatment, the better you did. The success rates, no matter how you measured them, showed that they were directly related to how long you were in treatment. Then, of course, it was not obvious then, but it became fairly obvious fairly quickly, because in many ways that looked like any successful treatment. You know, some appropriate dose would produce some appropriate outcome. And we kind of just used as a kind of an analogy, time in treatment as a dose, but we knew it wasn't time, and we knew that wasn't the doses you were getting. You were getting something else the longer you stayed in the program in terms of facilitating individual change. Well, that major finding, of course, which established a direct relationship between length of stay in treatment and ultimately post-treatment outcomes, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 7 years later, that relationship, which had been so replicated, essentially fell away as a guideline for policy and funding. And namely, we get the opposite, the shortening of treatment. And not only that, the requirement that as you shorten treatment, you still produce the long-term outcomes, which is kind of ridiculous, you know, in that sense. So these four areas, and as I mentioned, the internal issues of the erosion of fidelity, that outside factor, namely the successful application of the model to many populations and the shortening of treatment, did result in too many cases, the loss of the fidelity or the erosion, the weakening of the fidelity of treatment. And then, of course, the simple mandate that we needed less time to do more was the main contributor to that. So for the last decade or so, this reality that I just summarized to you has essentially been a part of my professional depression, if you like, because I kept raising the question of what was the future holding on us? Where were we going at this point? And the next few slides are just really about that story. So if you look at this slide, you see it says going forward. And for a long time, I didn't think we were going forward because the issue as I read it, and as you heard a little samples of it, was we had wonderful programs that were doing the best they can to serve all varieties of populations, every settings, meet every kind of regulatory requirement, shorten the treatment, and so on, and heroically working in the drug treatment and doing good work, but essentially not the work of long-term recovery, because one of the points on the previous slide that I didn't mention, what we don't have yet is a new generation of research on TCs and research outcomes on TCs of the magnitude that we had in the 70s and the 80s. Come back to that. But the issue there now is in that evolution that we're now talking about it, the two things emerged for me, which is the agencies, the great agencies, treatment programs, some of them represented here, were doing everything they could do and doing it well, and I'll keep arguing at the expense of the approach itself, and that the evolution going forward, what would be the next step? And for a long time, I felt, well, as long as therapeutic communities were still doing what they were going to do, it was going to be a troubled future. I now have a little bit of an optimism. I may be a little bit intoxicated by this, so you'll forgive me on that one, but I have a little bit of an optimism about this, which is this distinction between therapeutic community agencies, or large, which are now human services agencies, some of the very successful ones. For a long time, we had a kind of underlying guilt that we were not maybe adhering to the model in its purest sense. And there was I called it a kind of guilt, and that's an impeding emotion. I began to think what's actually happening is really the possibility of two evolutions. One is therapeutic communities evolving as they have and developing as human services agencies, doing the remarkable work, and as you'll see on the next slide, borrowing what they have learned from their own therapeutic community history to enrich the treatment offerings as a human service organization. The evolution of that, and is this, what I talked over here, the evolutionary arc of the survival of the current TCs of as a human services agency, what we can do about that survival, and then the evolutionary arc of a unique approach, which is, we've called community as method. And if we separate that for the moment and begin to view the future challenge in those two terms, I think we can see a little light at the end of the tunnel. So if we talk about going forward, we should think about two evolutions. One is let the TCs of today, as they're doing in all varieties, moving into prevention and so on, let them do what they're doing and essentially continue to serve in that way. There are some, I think, issues that they've got to pay attention to. They're on that slide. And on the second evolution is the survival, or I would now think the advancement of a unique approach, which we call community as method, which was the approach essentially operating in its early form, producing those long-term successes, which in cases essentially designed the whole future for the TC. How do you look at those two courses of evolution? So I would say in terms of the Human Services Organization, some of the points that are talking about, I want to just emphasize this, that they should be looking at what the appropriate client, this is going forward, what they should look like in terms of the appropriate client profiles, the appropriate settings, residential and all of which we're doing, and the appropriate goals for those clients. There, the emphasis, although not shown here, is are we still in the long-term recovery business, or are we essentially in the business of essentially advancing and improving the human condition for these people? It's a little bit different. So you need to, if you're going to be dealing with special populations under restricted planned durations of treatment and various regulatory requirements, you've got to come back to the issues, what's the appropriate goal for these clients? And we have to stop talking the talk of long-term recovery necessarily for those, because then you're writing a bad check. That is making a promise that maybe we can't keep. And of course, we don't have new research, a new generation of research to tell us that. And of course, what are many of our current therapeutic communities as human services agencies are utilizing is they're utilizing their history with therapeutic communities, borrowing a lot of therapeutic community elements, but that's not the same as essentially refining, advancing, and practicing high-fidelity community as method. That's a different approach. And then finally, of course, for the survival of human services, TCs as human services, they have to adhere to accountability standards. This is all publicly funded. So this is accountability standards. And that means, you should be evaluating outcomes, which we're not doing. We should be evaluating cost benefits. We're not doing that enough. And of course, continually engage in quality control and training in the field today. So that's a quick message to the existing TC industry in terms of the therapeutic community as human services agencies in many different settings now, and considering now how they should view themselves going forward. And again, I'm emphasizing this distinction between that and community as method. Okay, what about the future then of community as method? Now, I don't know whether everybody in this room is interested in that future. I'm interested in that future. And that is, it has to do with, of course, what we saw, at least I and maybe several others in the early years saw, was therapeutic communities as unique developments, participant developed, participants self-developed, as I mentioned earlier, and then that rapid era of 15 to 20 years of research showing what it can really do, and then ultimately developing a theory about this. And then finding out that when we began to see studies, those studies that were done, which were not replicating long-term effects, it was largely related to the issues of fidelity, which in turn were related to some of these policy issues, but also this internal issue of were they really adhering to fidelity. So it began to occur to us that for many of us working in the field, and there are some very notable examples of programs that began to see this from the early days for themselves. Were we really a public health treatment agency? We were a powerful approach that could deal with a public health problem, but were we a public health treatment agency? That distinction is important. And in that sense, it be increasingly clear that what we do in the therapeutic community when we are practicing community as method is that we are really a teaching community. All that's on the slide, we can't cover it here, but I'm willing to talk about it later in the conference if you're interested. And that is understanding even from the outset what therapeutic communities are, even the two words, communities that heal, if you use the definition of therapeutic as the healing definition, and as communities that heal, we have many kinds of communities that heal, which are not therapeutic communities for addictions. They go back 2,000 years. We have all varieties of that. So we don't have, I'm making some distinctions for you to bring us back to community as method. And then you have, communities that, all communities, if they are kind of healing communities, they share some elements. They provide sanctuary, they provide healing and support, but they're not all practicing community as method. That's not a criticism, it's just a difference. And when we get to actually therapeutic communities, which are communities that heal by labeling, we see that we're talking about a distinct variant of therapeutic communities. The emphasis is on healing and teaching. So one of the real advances in terms of understanding the difference between the modern therapeutic community for addictions and therapeutic communities, or all communities over 2,000 years that were healing communities, and existing communities today that heal, is that there was a great emphasis on teaching. So our approach that leads to what I'll call community as method, there's a great emphasis not only on healing, which is essentially the changing of feelings and injury so that people don't feel as wounded, that's the healing side, to the teaching side, which is learning how to live. So the emphasis on teaching is critical in understanding community as method. And then even within therapeutic communities for addictions, as you know, we have at least I've organized three variants of those, which all presumably were close to community as method. The standard one, which we won't get a chance to talk about here, but it's the classical approach that we need to further delineate. Modified TCs, which is the rule today. The modification of the TC has, in many cases, raised a lot of the issues I just referred to earlier. And then there are TCs that call themselves therapeutic communities, but they're really not. They simply are TC-oriented. They borrow some elements from the TC, but they borrow a lot of other evidence-based approaches. It's not a criticism, it's just a difference. But those are, at least existing today, three domains of therapeutic communities for addictions, all of whom use phrases like community as method. They have read the literature and so on. But in many ways, if you see what they're doing and who they're working with, you can see essentially how much deviation there has been. So I want to, before I go back to this teaching issue, is offer this definition so you get an idea at least how I see this and how you might consider what we mean by community as method. And maybe this definition will capture it for you, because I had to offer it to NIDA when they said, what do they really do there in therapeutic communities? And I had to kind of generate a definition for them. So I'll give you this. If it's a therapeutic community that's practicing community as method, then that means it is the purpose of use of the community, the word purposive, intentional use of a community. If we're the whole community in here today, we, the community, are going to teach you, the individual, how to use us, the community, to change yourself. The reciprocal relationship between the individual and the community. We, the community, will teach you, the individual, how to use us, the community, to change yourself. The us, the community, means all of the people, all of the relationships, and all of the activities that go on in a TC. So community, as a definition, if it's what we mean by community as method, that's what the community should be doing. All right, I'll go back now to the latest slide. So we get to this slide about the future of community as method, and you can see that on this first point, we're emphasizing the word teaching. So in talking about the phase of my talk, which is re-envisioning, I'm using the word academy. That's been used in TCs. They've got academies. Phoenix, in the early days of Phoenix House, we had an academy. And there are various programs that have called themselves academies, but academy really is teaching. You don't that's not a public health statement, that's an educational statement. And that showed early on that we were invested in that idea, that we were really teaching. And of course, in the re-envision going forward, if we wanted to nurture community as method, these are some of the points that we would essentially have to pay attention to. We'd have to set the appropriate goals, which we say are our real goals, which essentially were lifestyle and identity change, as two words or two phrases that capture that. You notice they're very global goals. That's not simply abstinence. That's much bigger than that. That's essentially teaching people right living and in terms of how they're going to live the rest of their lives. Much larger than the issues of achieving abstinence. Appropriate planned duration of stay. If a community as method is going to survive and not go extinct, which is the great danger today, that it will go extinct, if they're going to really advance and flourish, they're not only going to be able to essentially pursue their real goals, which is lifestyle change and identity change, but that would require a certain planned duration of stay, how long the individual is in that as an academy. Their curriculum, what we call our treatment programs, which shift to the language of teaching and curriculum, which would be a long-term curriculum based on the developmental understanding of how people change. The primary faculty would be individuals who would have been through that experience and necessarily as a detail here, even live on the campus, as some of the great universities have been able to demonstrate, but also including large numbers of selected what I call non-recovered people who didn't necessarily have to have a TC experience, but were special people and in terms of their roles in the academy. The university structure would be a graduate structure and a postgraduate structure. Incidentally, that language of postgraduate structure really essentially has as its analog the whole long-term reentry phase or continuity of care phase. But we're still talking now teaching and what individuals are going to have to learn when they move into that phase of not only they graduate the period of time of the primary curriculum, if you like, the 12 to 14 or 16 months of that, and then moving into this next stage, a way of understanding the relationship between the primary experience and, if you like, primary treatment or in, the first 12 months is everything you're learning about yourself, you're learning from this community that you're now living in. When you move into the next stage, you start learning more and more about yourself by using the world to teach yourself. And therefore, you still have to be very well connected to this community as you begin testing and retesting what you've learned in the primary community as you move into the macro community. So it's the whole reconception of what we mean by reentry. Okay, I think I might be able to get there. And finally, the funding source is going to be a little bit troubling for you. I'm now convinced that the primary exogenous factor that has affected the future of community as method is public funding. And so the recommendation going forward, or in the re-envisionment, I want to see new sources of funding, but not public funding, and no fee for service. There are several programs, fortunately now, that I've been able to visit that look somewhat like this, which has encouraged me. Everybody who comes to the door can come in, regardless of whether they have any money or not. There is, although, an extensive evaluation about where they are in terms of why they want to come in and so on. But no shutting the door on anybody. Anybody who comes in, comes in. And therefore, all the major funding issues have to come from other kinds of sources, and a reintroduction of what we tried to start 50 years ago, which is a lot more entrepreneurial work, the academies themselves producing money in an entrepreneurial way, along with other sources of funding. I realize how questionable that is in a lot of people's minds, but when I come back to it, I say, if we want to preserve community as method, we have to have essentially the full freedom to do that. So what we are teaching in the academies, just summarizing the features. What we teach right living, and that means regardless of the presenting problem, we teach right living. Addiction has been, of course, one of the main presenting problems. How we teach it experientially, direct experience, and didactically, which is relatively new even for community as method, even for the old TCs. A lot more, we can do a lot more now with didactic teaching in the new TC. And who are the teachers? All the members of the community. And of course, faculty, staff as faculty and role models, and the peers as role models. So that's just a summary slide, which would say, what do we mean in that feature? Here's a couple of other final points on this. What would those academies look like if, and some of them I think exist in part around the world. I have this as an opening bulletin. A selected one of them, or two of them actually, we should be thinking about how we're creating centers of excellence. One of them becomes an example of the high-powered community as method approach, and essentially becomes the oasis and resource for teaching at regional levels, other academies as they begin to develop. Fully developed alumni associations. Here's a phenomenon that has stumbled over 50 years in TCs. The power of the alumni association. Some programs are remarkable at this, and that gives me hope. Long-term TCs developing alumni associations which begin to carry out a lot of the case management issues that we now have essentially forfeited back to the public sector. But the alumni associations could be very, very strong entities which keep the individual in community as well as help facilitate their re-engagement in the world, and they're constantly retesting their re-engagement in the world. And this final point is, I want to make, I'll go back to the evaluation issue, but the final point here is that these academies, as I envision them as a futuristic point, really stand alone. They can be part of your organizations. This is one of the things I've said to the early Phoenix, or the later Phoenix House, which didn't work out, and try to advise some of the old-time programs as they gave up on long-term treatment, saying if you had essentially moved to a strategy of a separate development, this separate academy, there's no reason why they should be unaffiliated with the Human Services Organization. But it has to stand alone as a separate academy. So you can, in effect, in the idealized version of my re-envisionment, you can have the TC as Human Services organizations doing what they're doing, but they have to essentially have this as a standalone entity, if they want that. Otherwise, we're going to have just standalone academies, which are like this. And then, of course, this point about evaluation and research to maintain fidelity and document effectiveness. This is, of course, my recommendation to every program in the House. You have to be doing this. We certainly need it in a new generation of research, whether you're a generalized human services organization or you're a very unique academy of the sort that I'm talking about, a long-term teaching academy. It's going to only survive through evaluation. I don't mean now just money, but only through evaluation that continued the process of refinement and advancement. Let me stop for the moment then. Okay.